to season 2. I think it's episode number 4 of our Chai Time, and we have a great panel here ready to discuss academic spin-outs in the UK and the US, and to see the differences and see how we can learn from each other. It's been an interesting week in Cambridge. I got back from France last week, so just escaped the lockdown after let's call it chai stroke wine and champagne in the regions out there. I think Christine, you just made it back as well on Monday from France, I believe.
Yes, indeed.
Escaped the lockdown, whizzing from Italy right through to make it back to Cambridge. And Peter, did you manage to get away?
No, not been away. Staycation for me, really, in the UK, but it's been good.
Good man, keeping it safe. And Vinit, did you get away this year?
Actually, believe it or not, I took my son, who turned 30 this year, to Utah, and we did a road trip through the canyons and go to Utah. So I actually got on a flight. It was a good experience, surprisingly.
Probably an empty experience.
No, actually,
really?
Delta flight. They kept the middle seats open. Other than that, the flight was pretty full.
Wow, very good. So I've had a lot of questions about my garden at the back through the Chai Times. And so I decided to, because the weather's been so hot and raining, the fruits have kind of bloomed early. So look, prizes on a postcard if you can come up with the brand of fruit or the label of fruit. So this is one of the apples from the garden. No idea what it's called. One of the pears. So hopefully we get some messages say, what kind of pear, what kind of apple is this? There's a good buddy of mine that runs a Cambridge fruit company, Neil Baradwar. I'm sure he'll be messaging me on these. Plums.
Wow.
Another apple. So yeah, I don't know what variety they are, but I'm dying to know. So please, someone's already messaged already. Look, I'll have to see that in a second. But before we go into more fruit talk, I'd like you all to introduce yourself. So Christine, maybe you can go first.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Sanil, for inviting me to talk to everybody today. My name is Christine Martin. I'm the Head of Life Science Investment at Cambridge Enterprise. And Cambridge Enterprise is the wholly owned subsidiary of the University of Cambridge, who work to help commercialise technologies from the research output of the university. And previous to working the seed funds team, I was in the tech transfer team. So I have an understanding of all the complexities of the IP. And before that, I was actually in a biotech company. So I have seen some of this from the other side as well.
Christine, so we had a look at when I was writing up your note for the panel, I realized that we'd invested in at least half of your portfolio, but that's good or bad. But maybe you would just run through the companies that you look after.
So I'm a board member, director of Z-Factor, Absintex, Polyprox, Qkine, and Spirea, and PharmEnable. And actually, I'm not a director, I'm an observer of Absintex, and I'm also an observer of Carrick and Bilitech. But I actually look after a much wider portfolio. But there is, being a director and even an observer is, a significant responsibility, and it takes time and effort and resource to do it properly. So we try to limit the time that we spend being directors of companies. And therefore, we work with companies in the early stages when they need the help the most. And when they get to the exciting bits where they're doing fine, we tend to step away and recycle our resources for the companies that maybe need us more.
Well, I can say at least half those companies from good authority are fantastic companies. I'm sure the other half are too. Peter.
They all are.
Hi. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to be on the panel. Real pleasure to be here today. My name is Pete Lane. I work for a technology incubator called the Sussex Innovation Centre. We're a wholly owned subsidiary of the University of Sussex down in the southeast of the UK. And our relationship with the university, if you like, changed about 12 years ago. When we were an independent incubator, we became wholly owned by the university. And we leverage, if you like, our experience of incubating startups and scale-up companies to apply our team that we have in-house on our expertise in that level to support the university in its ambitions around commercializing intellectual property and interesting research within the university, which is not just within the life science sector, right across the whole university in different areas ourselves. And as an incubator, we're not specifically focused in that area.
Thank you very much, Peter. That's fantastic. Vinit, maybe you can give us a potted history of your background.
Yeah, would love to. So saying hello from the other Cambridge on the other side of the Atlantic. So I started my first company as an engineering student at the University of Waterloo in Canada. And my companies have been acquired by Boeing, Motorola, Qualcomm, Mitel. So as you can see, I was a tech entrepreneur. 14 years ago, I decided to move from being what I call a parent, starting and running companies, to being a grandparent, helping others. And that took two forms. One was teaching at Boston University, which I've been doing every semester since 2008. And I also joined a venture capital firm, Key Ventures, which didn't quite make it through the Lehman downturn, but have been angel investing. So the stint at BU also included running the tech transfer office at BU for 6 years. And in those 6 years, we launched 8 venture-backed companies that have raised over $350 million to date. And in that process, I learned life sciences. So that was interesting. And now I took that experience, and now I run the Mass Tech Transfer Center, which helps all the 34 research institutions in Massachusetts do a better job of academic spinouts. And as of about a month ago, we merged Mass Tech Transfer Center with another quasi-public agency called Mass Ventures, which, by the way, has been around for 40 years, well before the private venture capital industry. In fact, helped spawn the private venture capital industry here in Massachusetts. So we're now part of Mass Ventures. So it's gone full circle. So I'm pretty focused on academic spinouts, but also run a number of funds, a clean energy fund, a life sciences fund, and an academic spinout fund, all sort of early stage.
No, that's all three of you. It's fantastic to have you here today. Vinit, I met you in your office. We just about remembered about 10 years ago when I probably came to pitch to you for something or other. And I always remembered that you were, gave me plenty of time, even though I was sort of a fairly juniory person in my career then. You've always been, a good figure in the industry and very well known, well respected. So thank you for making the time for us today. So I'm going to give you the first question, actually. Straight off.
By the way, I just wanted to say it's chai time, so I brought my chai.
Oh, yes. But you know what? In the UK, it's kind of chai / gin and tonic time. So it's kind of, I've had my beers in here before as well. It's all good. I think, because we have this panel of from both sides of the pond, I thought it'd be interesting to try to pick apart a little bit how a spin out goes through the cycle in the US, or at least in your experience, because it could be different from university for university or state to state. And maybe you can give how you've experienced with the 5 or 8 that you were working on at BU, and maybe how that differs from other states. And then we can see from this side of the pond how that differs or how it works over here. So over to you, Vinit.
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, I mean, the U.S. is a massive place, and so the different ecosystems with eds and meds, if I may call it that, education and medicine, differ. So Boston happens to be an area which is very vibrant and rich as an entrepreneurial ecosystem. So the ingredients to do these academic spinouts all exist here. And so in some ways, the risk is lower. And so when I say all the ingredients, in particular, I mean sort of 3 ingredients, right? Ingredient 1, probably the most important, are entrepreneurial champions, as I call them. They're people, who've had experience in doing spinouts, academic and non, who know what it's like to, find the product market fit, find resources, funding, and grow companies. We have plenty of those people. In fact, I have a platform called MassVX where we connect these academic spinouts with entrepreneurial champions. I've got 450 entrepreneurial champions, right, available to me to connect in. The second is funding. And, again, Boston's always been number 2 or number 3 in the availability of risk investment. And frankly, right now, for life sciences, we're number 1, right? And I would say more broadly, deep tech. So not just life sciences, but also advanced materials and, AI, those kind of things. We have plenty of private capital, and frankly, the state, not so much, but, fills in the gaps as needed. And really the third ingredient is sort of access to market. And, particularly in life sciences, every biopharma company, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 has a presence here now in Boston, Cambridge. And that's sort of happened over the last decade. So I would say that in some ways, our risk is lower here to do academic spinouts, but nonetheless, we face almost all the same obstacles, I'm sure, that people do in England or in India or anywhere else, which is, a lot of these academic technologies are technologies in seek of a market, right? There's really 2 ways to do a startup. The best way to do a startup is find a hole in the market, then organize technology and resources to fill it. Most of these university things are the other way around. It's some professor who got excited about something and, went ahead and said, oh, I think this could be commercialized, files an invention disclosure. And then you've got to really figure out, is there a market opportunity here? I actually created a course to teach that, by the way.
Vinny, on that point, because what you've described is kind of the environment, the ecosystem, which hopefully makes your spin-outs more feasible, more achievable, and more likely of success. So on that ecosystem point, I'm just going to jump to the other 2 panelists, and then we can actually pick apart how that happens. That was a good intro. So perhaps we can go to Peter and then Christine as to how the ecosystem works in Sussex and in Cambridge.
Well, certainly picking up on some of the points made there, we don't have anything like the kind of scale, if you like. The idea of a large stable of entrepreneurial champions that can help sort of Sussex spin outs is a dream, quite frankly. I'd love to have that. But at the end of the day, what we often have is individuals actually that we look for, obviously, mentors. We very much look for people with experience. We very much, in terms of academic spin-outs, are seeking teams and people that can help fulfill different roles within those companies to help, very much from the commercial side as opposed to the scientific side. Otherwise, it will becomes very balanced towards the science. Funding, again, I completely agree from the point of view of the kind of opposite way round that I would normally work with a company that's a scale up or a startup from a commercial point of view, is we're often working backwards from a technology problem that's kind of given to us, an opportunity that's given to us to find out what the problem is that it solves outside of its research context, which is often in a different place to grant funding, where it's kind of found, if you like, how it's been developed. So I think it's a very different landscape to the one that you're describing, really, to be honest, in that, that there's a whole host of sort of jigsaw puzzle pieces that we have to try and put together. One from a teamwork point of view, and another work from a point of view really discovering the problem that this technology, this piece of IP, this spin out can actually solve at the beginning. If that makes sense.
That makes sense. Thank you for that, Peter. I mean, it is obviously a more challenging environment for the spin-outs in the UK because of the ecosystem that exists here, and we all know the ecosystem that exists in Boston. But maybe is Cambridge somewhere in between, do you think, Christine?
Well, maybe somewhere in between. Probably very much on the UK side of things. Although, I mean, Cambridge does have an extensive and quite mature ecosystem. There are a huge number of spin out and startup companies. They're not all from the university. There are lots of science parks around the area with, you know, some of them focus on life sciences and some of them are more focused on tech companies. The obviously the technology substrate that we get to work with is absolutely superb. There are loads of entrepreneurs, first-time entrepreneurs, serial entrepreneurs. There's a lot of understanding of how to start companies, and it's not that you have to kind of reteach every person how the system works, but it's, you know, but it's not Boston. I think that, you know, as has already been said, you know, the technologies aren't necessarily spin out ready. We spend a lot of time working with initially academic teams, but then bringing other talent to complement the academic teams. And yes, often that is on the commercial or business side of things, or sometimes actually it's on, you know, the regulatory or manufacturing side of things, depending on the opportunity. And we have a lot of very experienced entrepreneurs, and we have quite a lot of mentors. But what we find most difficult, I think, in the creation side of things, is bringing the employee talent into the company. So people who will actually take that, you know, quite high risk first CEO role. So the person who's kind of at the end of your finger when you need to point at someone and say, right, what are you actually doing now? Who's going to take responsibility for this? Who's going to get on board this ship?
Do you think that's because in the US, startup is cool? Startup CEO is cool, and here it's still seen as, oh, that sounds very risky, even though they probably get paid what they were getting paid in industry, or very close.
Yeah, well, it might be a cultural thing, and I think there is a point about just numbers of people. When we have quite a lot of startup activity in Cambridge, is, you know, it's a big ecosystem, but it's not as big as the ecosystems in the US.
I mean,
so
450 entrepreneurs ready to go is something else, Vinny. I mean, that is huge.
Exactly. I mean, that is absolutely enviable, because I mean, we do all kinds of, you know, crazy searches to try and bring the right talent to the right companies, and I think that, I don't know if people are more risk averse or if they're just as a smaller pool, so it's harder, particularly when you're coming straight out of a university, trying to get a really good first time CEO when they've probably got, you know, I think it's a ratio thing. There are often more, and I wouldn't necessarily say better, but less risky offers for people than the one where they come into a company and it's coming straight out of the university and there's only a professor and a postdoc and maybe one other person involved. And, you know, you really have to bring somebody on your journey to get them to jump ship from wherever they were before.
So at what point would you spin out of a university? At what point in the company creation process would you, and say, Peter, maybe you could answer combined one after the other, and then we'll see the point of spin out in the US and see if it's a different stage. Do we go out much earlier than we should, or is it about the same?
Well, I think, well, you know, all of these things are very company to company dependent.
But typically, if you generalize.
Typically, as late as possible, you know, because the more mature your foundation is, the more it's going to be valued by the investors. Therefore, the more equity ownership the founders are going to have. So the more incentivized the founders are going to be, the shorter time there is then to get to a product. But, you know, very few of our companies would have any revenue in the first year of their existence. You know, if we can get a company, say a company that's making, whether say a bit of kit for the lab or what have you, if we can get them to revenues in 2 or 3 years, that would be fantastic.
What about the therapeutic side in terms of an idea of a drug or a lead optimization? Or
well, that tends to be when we can get a lead investor who's going to come on that journey with us. And you know what? Storm was started on target concepts. You know, Z Factor was started through privileged access to a crystal structure. XO1 was started with an antibody. And all of those were started because we talked to a lead investor who bought into the idea, saw the path to the clinic, and was prepared to take the risk.
Yeah.
So it could be anywhere, but on drug discovery, it is really tough because you need somebody with a big checkbook.
So Vinit, I was going to go direct to the US. Where do you spin out? Is it earlier, later? Can you incubate much longer in-house or before you spin out?
Yeah, so it depends on the technology, but the one thing, and again, I came out of tech entrepreneurship where you have an idea. I bootstrapped my first two companies, grew them to 10 million run rate, and I owned all of it. And you could do that. When I came to the academic environment, a couple of things sort of occurred to me. One was, and I said this sort of blanket is keep it in the university as long as you can. And I would say the number one reason for doing that is because the university is a low-cost protective environment. Meaning, grad students are underpaid and overworked, and you have lots of them. You can get access to non-dilutive funding, which you may not be able to get access to, like NIH funding, government funding, and things like that. And you definitely want to at least get it to a point where you've done proof of concept, so you've lowered the risk on the science, right? And so that, and ideally, if you're talking about a medical device or a new drug, you've done some animal testing, already. So you sort of lowered. So we would think about getting it to that stage before we would think about trying to go attract private capital or connect them with.
So that sounds to me as a slightly more mature stage than we would typically do in the UK, although it does vary, and some do get housed longer. But I think that we would, in the UK, they typically spin out earlier, and I think that's probably because of the funding situation of the in-house capital to fund these opportunities. I'm going to come from a business point of view here and say, look, the speed of execution in industry is insane. I mean, there's a huge need to do things quickly once you've got investor money in. You've got a team of people who do things fast. They just want to get things done. It may not always have the same motivations in an academic environment. The motivations or the goals for success and maybe not be financial or milestone driven. They could be publication driven. So this dichotomy of goals may play a part in how quickly you can get things done. So it's really, I'm going to ask this question about speed of execution within the academic environment, and when you spin it out, how do you see that differing? I'm going to go to Peter first.
Yeah, no, I think the speed of execution and development within academia is definitely something that is far more restricted than the commercial world. And the speed of grant funding and decisions and the likelihood of actually securing grant funding, particularly if that's what academics are going for, is can potentially, in some cases, risk the technology, risk the IP not being in a position to actually be able to take advantage of it commercially if you don't move fast enough. So I think there's always that tension in that environment. So I think there's always that balance to be fed really between what we try and do, which we sort of touched on very much before, is really understanding the opportunity for the technology out there in the marketplace and the timing for when that needs to happen, and then sort of feeding that back into how fast that can be moved forwards within the university, whether there are internal funds to do that or whether we're relying on grant funding bodies to do that. And that can torpedo the business model, quite frankly, if you can't position something fast enough into an environment, into a stage whereby you can actually leverage that, move it forwards you can be leapfrogged. And I think that's always a worry that academics have and universities have, is that and indeed probably the investment community, is that being leapfrogged and someone else coming in, and if you like, getting the stick in the sand from an IP point of view earlier, which touches on another point really as to how early you look to protect something like that.
Yep, we'll come back to the IP's question next. But Vinit, in terms of
Yeah,
getting things done.
let's talk about speed for a second, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's, first of all, I think it's a misnomer that everybody in academia is not sort of driven by speed. So the one thing you find in the research commercialization world is that academic behavior varies quite a bit. I mean, you have some academics who are actually quite proficient and understand what private capital wants, understand what industry wants, and have their labs really aligned towards it. The number of those people across our 34 institutions in Massachusetts probably numbers in low hundreds, right? These are people I can go to. They're prolific inventors. Some of them are prolific commercializers, and they're frankly very easy to work with. So out of the 8 spin-outs I did with BU, I quickly discovered who those were. 3 of those 8 were done by one guy, right? Jim Collins, who's now at MIT. He was at BU at that time, but now he's at MIT. So, and he was sort of, riffing on Bob Langer and saw how Bob Langer did it. And so, and then Bob Langer's had a number of students who stayed in academia, like Jeff Karp and others, who were just really good at it and they're very easy to deal with, right? Then you have others who, either are trying to do it for the first time, and that's fine, if we can get the behavior right. But then there's many others, whose behavior is determined by their success or failure in the one they did. So if it was a failure, it was because of somebody else, and if it was a success, it was because of them. And so you have to sort of manage this behavior, and I think getting the right entrepreneurial champion in to help manage that is really critical. You're on mute.
I always find when I go to the US that the academic entrepreneurs may have done it before a couple of times, and they've had this, like you said, with Bob Lang and his students, and they've come through. They understand that alignment. Maybe we are still going it through for the first time, starting maybe second, and maybe we've just been through a few more cycles in the US in this space. Christine, Peter, do either of you want to jump in on that point?
So I think a couple of really key points were made across all of that, and I would agree that there are many very proficient academics, and actually I think part of the speed issue with doing research within the university, certainly in the UK, is the length of time it takes you to raise grant money. And if it's a 13-month process to get from application to actually being awarded the grant, if you wanted to file IP, for example, on the output of your previous academic research, and then you need to wait 13 months in order to get the grant money to start the exploitation of that, then that's a completely dead time. And in drug discovery, 13 months is a big window of time. And I think that's one of the issues with retaining the work within academia in the UK. It's not that it couldn't be done, and some people will do it very proficiently, and some people have a lot of experience because maybe they're serial entrepreneurs, so they have done it before and they are very aligned with what they know people want to see. But if the translational grant funding can't come fast enough, actually, if their idea is amazing and is competitive and might get leapfrogged, then spinning out earlier can be a way to make the progress that cannot be made in the academic setting. Because of course, as Peter was saying, in the academic setting, the work that people do is restricted because you apply for a grant and then you have to deliver on the milestones of that grant. And it's not so straightforward to get halfway through a grant and go, you know what, if I pivot this, it could be brilliant. I could go somewhere and make something really amazing and commercial. If the grant said, well, actually, you're supposed to keep on the same trajectory, it's quite difficult to change things dramatically in that way. And I think oftentimes, if people say, do you start drug discovery companies too early? And sometimes we are criticized for starting drug discovery companies too early. And the answer is, well, maybe, but actually there wasn't any other choice. If we wanted to exploit that and commercialize that piece of academic research, either we started a company or we just publish it and let it go. And some people may say, well, you should publish it and let it go and someone else can exploit it. But actually, the only person who's already on that journey of wanting to see that piece of technology through is the academic PI and their postdoc or their close team. And things which are just published are much less frequently picked up and exploited elsewhere.
I would just, Sunil, I might just add, so the one other big advantage we have here is that our academic institutions are brilliant at raising philanthropy for translation. I mean, you know, we have the Weiss Institute at Harvard with $500 million. We got the Broad Institute at MIT and Harvard with $1 billion. Every university's got something. They've got translational funding for proof of concept work. They've got sometimes equity funding available to sort of participate in the first round. And that's a real advantage that we have here. And I don't see as much in the UK that you see that much philanthropy sort of driving into academia for translation.
Well, so I just move on to one of the questions actually, and it kind of my dog. So someone's going to talk. This is live. Dog's gone. So my question, I was going to take Craig's question, Craig Townsend, who's asked a question around IP, and the UK institutions are charitable. They have a charitable status. Their goals are maybe slightly different. Has the thinking changed as to when a company would file IP now, maybe 10 years ago, and how is it different in the US? So why don't Christine and Peter take it here, and then we move to Vinit.
So if I understand your question, is your question about whether or not the charitable status of the institution has an impact on when we file IP?
No, actually, that was just a point around the moving on from Vinit's point, which was around they have a lot of philanthropy in terms of investing and starting. In the UK, we are charities. I don't think in the US you're charities. The university is not a charity. I don't think. Won't cover that point. But the questions have moved on to IP when we file it.
So in the university, well, certainly in Cambridge University, and in fact, UK universities each tend to have an IP policy, and each university will have to follow its own IP policy. And in Cambridge, it's very straightforward. If an academic comes to Cambridge Enterprise and says, I've discovered this thing, whatever, Cambridge Enterprise have 30 days to decide whether or not to file a patent. Now, obviously, that can be extended as long as that's okay with the academic and the team. But if you go by the book, they could receive a preprint of a paper, have 30 days to decide if to file a patent or not, and then the paper publishes. And of course, I'm sure we'll all appreciate that many times the technology, even if it looks amazing, is probably or can often be not quite fully enabled for a patent application. And then you have lots of questions about if you want to file a patent and the paper is going to publish, is it actually going to be possible for you to add examples post-publication in order to demonstrate the enablement of the patent? So, so whether or not something is patented tends to be tends to be approached in a very discursive way. So we will have at least a couple of people from Cambridge Enterprise. We will talk with the academic team, and you know, and if they're really eager to patent and to publish, bearing in mind if they have an amazing publication, that might bring them a £5 million grant funding in 6 months. They file a patent, you know, that might or might not have a successful commercialization plan over the next X number of years, which might or might not then have a financial impact on them as individuals. So it's very important, we find, to work very closely with the academics, because you need to have an alignment of purpose, because you know the purpose isn't to file a patent. Either the collective purpose is to commercialize the technology, or the academic's purpose is to publish and, you know, and therefore attract grant money, better students, and, you know, and improve their name in academia. So I think it's really important that the people around the table are very aligned in what they want to do, because, you know, you publish a patent, if that's the beginning of a commercialization route, that could be a relationship that's going to be going on for the next number of years.
Vinny, over to the US, what do you think? How's it different?
Yeah, I don't think it's that different. I would say, first of all, US universities are either private nonprofits or public nonprofits. So they are all charities, if charity equals nonprofit. So that, you know, they don't pay taxes, so they are, you know, charities. I would say that almost all universities would say that their patent policy, first and foremost, is to encourage their faculty to commercialize their IP to benefit society, first and foremost. Making money is not the first and foremost, you know, target. So there really isn't more pressure to commercialize than there was 20 years ago, frankly. If there's any more desire to commercialize, it's because the nature of research commercialization and the nature of faculty has changed. So faculty increasingly are beginning to see commercialization as being, you know, as valuable to their resume as a signature publication. Not across the board, but for STEM type faculty, increasingly that's true. And in some cases, you know, they're discovering that they can make some money too, and, you know, go buy a bigger house or a boat. And so that, you know, that incentive is not a bad thing. I mean, we live in a
It's a very good thing. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Peter, is that different at Sussex, or is it sort of the same line?
No, I think it aligns very closely, really. And really, it's the conversation about filing a patent sometimes starts far too late in the process, I think, really, to be honest. And as a kind of a team, you know, we work very closely with the university's kind of knowledge transfer team. We can sometimes be left almost in an ultimatum position of, you know, something's got to be published, and, you know, do we patent it? And really, it's almost an ask to the university as to whether you want to patent it, as opposed to, are we leveraging it around a kind of commercialization strategy, or do we want to spin a company out or in some way leverage that in a license? So I think there's a huge thing here, really, certainly from Sussex's point of view, in moving that kind of that ambition, that strategy, those milestones further down the process, so that academics are thinking about that perhaps earlier in their research, engaging with them earlier in their research, and that's much better now than I think it has been in past years, but it's still a lot more that we could do to actually improve that, I think.
I mean, having been involved in several spin-outs, I think it's one of the issues that comes up every time we try to do this is, can we withdraw the patent to refile it, to exemplify it more thoroughly, discussing timing of publication so that we have enough time to get a head start, which is obviously what you're paying for, and to make sure the academic founders engage, because they can be your biggest assets. So, you know, you've got to try and balance up the whole thing, and the goals are different. So it can be quite a challenge, but that's, you know, that's the area we work in. There's value there. You've just got to try and make it work for everybody. I'm just going to flick through to some of the other questions. We've got from Priya Patel, is probably a difficult one actually, but how do you divvy up the equity between the students and the professors working on a project? Do you get involved in that, or do you let them fight it out?
Yeah, I mean, our policy is pretty straightforward, and I would say most institutions in Massachusetts have a similar policy, which is as the basis starting off is that all inventors on a patent equally, you know, are equally divided in any royalties that emerge from that patent. Now, that could be, you know, a professor and some students. Now, if between them they decide to have an unequal split, you know, we would help them think that through. There's a conflict of interest committee that's going to look after the, you know, the rights of the students, because sometimes, you know, professors can, you know, be a little bit more demanding, and the students will have a hard time resisting. Now, equity is different. So we're now talking about sort of inventors and royalties that emerge, you know, connected to the patent policy. If you're going to do a spin out as opposed to licensing it to a going concern, that startup will have a capital table, and there'll be, you know, a founder's kind of equity situation. And that will definitely be negotiated amongst the founders of the startup. I have created a Google Docs set of documents of, you know, what a founder's agreement should look like, what are typical equity splits, what's typical royalties that you should be asking for when you negotiate with the university. So we've tried to collect all that data, we put it all in one place, and we just make it available to these people. Then it's up to them how they negotiate it.
Thank you. Peter, Christine, is it pretty much each one depends, and who added what value in a bit of a fight, and would you have a formulaic process to it?
So for Cambridge, incredibly similar to what you've just heard. The IP is effectively, or the sharing of the IP, which is what goes into the company, will have one collection of stakeholders. And that collection of stakeholders can decide between themselves what the share is. And if they can't decide between themselves, it's equal. And each of those inventors actually has a whole series of stakeholders behind them, which are the funders of their work. And so the funders of their work will want to know that the share of the IP is fair, and they will also want to have the opportunity oftentimes to agree that that was fair. But when it comes to founding a company, the founders need to agree what the fair split is between themselves. And also, if the IP is going in for equity, what the fair split is between what happened before and what's contained within that license, if you like, and what is going to happen going forwards. And so the share between the license and the founders. So like the pre-money collective. And then, you know, and then everyone needs to agree whether there's going to be an option pool, and is the option pool going to dilute everybody, or is it going, because there might be people who didn't invent the IP and aren't necessarily founders, but you want to make sure that they have some handle on the equity as well, like if you're bringing in a senior management person or an SAB or something. So that, but it comes down to the point that I made before, is that if everyone is aligned in purpose, then people will think that it's good to give some equity to the incoming CEO, because you want them to be motivated and you want them to stay, and you don't want to underpay your key talent. You want them to feel valued so that they add value. If everybody is aligned in a purpose, then actually there shouldn't be a bun fight. Everyone should feel like where they've ended up is fair, and that goes for the IP and the founders.
I'm going to ask Peter now to give an example of a spin out that he's done, and what worked well in that spin out, and why it worked well, and maybe some lessons for everybody, and maybe if you can think of one that didn't work very well, and lessons to be learnt there. And I'm going to go around to each one of you and ask the same question.
Interesting, really. I mean, we've had some interesting spin outs. When I think of one actually, which is probably more interesting, which is a sort of almost a spin in, where some guys came in from Novartis and came into the university, if you like, to bring up their expertise in academic roles, but in doing so also leveraged the university facilities, the university support in moving forwards, both in being based in the Innovation Centre as we have now, but also in the machinery and the technology that exists within the university that otherwise would be too much of a stretch for them at an early stage. Companies that have failed, and why? Well, I think often you'll have academics that don't necessarily think through what their ambitions are commercially, and whether that's a role that fits them from a personality point of view is not for everyone. It's not limited just to academia. We see it in scale-ups and startups within the incubator as well, is people that believe what they want to do is spin their research out and use it, if you like, for the good of society, but for good reasons. I guess they've started their career as academics and they're within an academic institution and they really love that, and that's where they've built their career. And sometimes I think what fails is they feel that that's what they should do. They get to a point where their IP is at the point of commercialization, and they almost feel like they're kind of beholden to take part in a spin out and move that out. And if you like, it's the kind of...
It's not ready, it's not right for them or whatever, yeah.
No, it's not. No, it's not. It just doesn't fit the personality type. I think there's sometimes conflict within companies. That, you know, there's often argument within companies and things like that. That just doesn't fit the personality type sometimes. We often see that.
Yep. So Christine, can you give us a named example of a company that worked and an unnamed example of one that didn't work? And you've got 1 minute because we're getting...
Okay. So for example, a recent company we started, Farm Enable, and it worked because the CEO completely can sell her vision, and it's, you know, AI assisted drug discovery, so it's hot right now, and she's got a great team. They've already got proof of concept projects, so they've got real data and evidence, and they, in fact, when they came to us, they were looking to raise a certain amount of money, and we said, you know what, this is much earlier this year. We said, this is going to be a tough year. Raise more if you can, and they did. I mean, they ticked every box. They did everything right. And you know what? They listened to every piece of advice that they got, and they've got a great set of advisors as well. So that worked really well, and that's got off to a great start.
We have the CEO of Farm Enable coming on our chai time in next but one, just for...
That's why I thought I would give her a bit of a plug. So the ones which tend to, I wouldn't say that we have companies that work badly. There tend to be companies that don't quite start off, and they tend to be for generally one or two reasons. One will be because actually the founding team are not aligned. You know, one of them wants to do something that's a bit different to something else. So if you've got a technology that could either be some sort of research reagent cell-based early revenue generating opportunity, or it could be a platform for a drug discovery, and basically you've got a tension between the potential founders. We've had a couple of occasions where that hasn't worked, and actually we haven't really ended up pursuing either, which is unfortunate for a technology that has come out of you know, publicly funded research, you know. So if there's a misalignment of expectations between the founding team, that tends to be not ideal. And the other thing that tends to be not ideal, and has come up a number of times recently, is when people kind of they get together quite quickly. They say, oh, we've got this brilliant idea, we're going to do something amazing, can you please fund us, and our company, and we want a pre-money value of 8 million or something. And actually, even if the technology is amazing, you know that they're going to struggle at that pre-money value. Either they'll struggle to raise their A round, or the A round investors will completely crush them, and there will be an unfortunate situation in the future. We tend not to get involved in companies where the expectations we think the expectations are misaligned with what the future investors will be prepared to invest in, because we want to start companies that are going to last, be successful, bring those benefits to society. We don't want to start companies that effectively are going to fall off a cliff at the next round.
That's a great point, Christine. Vinit?
Yeah, you know, the adage is that there's one reason why these spin-outs succeed, and there's many reasons why they fail.
Yeah.
You know, the one reason they all succeed is because you have a good team, and, you know, the teams are adept at, you know, finding the resources and making things happen. And I'll give you a couple of those examples. I mean, we had, you know, one spin out, Synologic, that went out with a 30+ million first round. right? And it's gone on to raise a lot of money. It's gone public. Jury's still out whether, it'll actually come out with the therapy, but that's, it's a high risk, high reward game. We had another spin out, Beta Bionics, where the faculty member was driven day one to come up with a closed loop type 1 diabetes device because his son was diagnosed with it, when he was 9 or 10 years old. And he said, by the time he gets to college, I'm going to have a device on the market. And completely didn't take any of our advice about getting an entrepreneurial champion. I had money lined up. I had CEOs lined up. I had everything. He did it himself. And he's raised over $100 million. He leads the pack. He's ahead of Medtronic. He's ahead of everybody else right now. Right? There's a company called Beta Bionic. On the failure side, there are two that I would pop out. One, everything was great. I had a great entrepreneurial champion, good technology, good paper, good IP, raised kind of a $1 million seed from angels, got an SBIR, usual stuff. Had a Series A term sheet from Merck. In the diligence, Merck says, we cannot find this protein in humans. In other words, everything was built on the fact that this, protein, the papers, the IP, everything was built on the proteins. It turned out it existed in animals, but not in humans. And unfortunately, it became a pissing contest, pardon the terms, between the CEO and the scientific founders, and a lot of finger pointing. I tried to help, intervene. I got thrown under the bus by everybody. And eventually didn't give up on it. So the company collapsed, but it turned out they had actually seen something. It wasn't the protein they thought they were seeing. So, we sort of went back and discovered that, but it was a disaster. And then the last example I'll give is where my new ventures person said, hey, we're going to co-found this thing. And I said, okay, what does that mean? Well, we're going to get 1/3 of the equity. And I said, do we really want that? But anyway, she felt strongly about it. And so we did it. What a mistake. So, that's one thing universities should never be, is co-founders and own too much equity in these spin-outs, because whenever these companies get into any trouble, like they can't pay their patent expenses or whatever, they're going to say, well, you're a co-founder. So suck it up. You're the bank. You're the bank.
It's quite clear that there's a huge amount of value in getting this done correctly, getting the alignment between the entrepreneurs and the investors, the founders and the university. And if we all work together, we can spin ideas, novel therapeutics or med tech devices out, technology that really can benefit society, but at the same time create a huge amount of value. It's very, very, very difficult to get it right. And I've made mistakes when I spun things out earlier on. And to get that balance right, it does take experience. It is really not easy to do. I think, you guys do a great job in doing what you've done, and you have tremendous experience. But if we all work together, the investors and the university and the academic founders, we can really do some great stuff here. This is, for me, where the innovation happens at this stage. I mean, this is where you really shape the company, you correctly put the cap table in place, set it up for, quite nicely to the Series A. And once you get to a Series A, there's a lot more money that can come in, but it's very difficult at this stage, at least in the UK, but in this sort of pre-seed stage of investment, especially in life sciences or therapeutics, where most of the larger funds will just say, look, we'll wait till it comes out earlier. And most of the earlier funds, the seed funds, don't have the level of due diligence to be able to make those investments. And so there's not that much capital, I feel, at the pre-seed seed stage for these university spin-outs in specifically therapeutics. But if you can spin this out, put the building blocks in place, develop the technology, sort out the IP, and take it to the next stage, I think there's plenty of capital available. And that includes US capital coming into the UK, because there's such an abundance of capital chasing therapeutics. If you can get it to a stage where it's more tangible I think we have a great chance of success of making this work. I do feel there's huge challenges still, and framework can be improved massively from my experience, and I'm sure that you could, or each of you, write a book on this. But hopefully today we've got out some of the issues on the table, and people can at least start to think about it. I think we've answered most of the questions from Yurik, Jamie and Peter as well as Craig. So I tried to skirt around them to give them some answers somewhat in terms of being able to answer questions. However, apologies if I didn't get around to everybody on that side. Want to thank the panelists for their time again today. I want to skip very quickly to my last point, which is my fruit. I've got some answers. I've got Granny Smith for the green apple. I'm not sure. That's you. You said that. I don't think so. I've got a discovery apple. Discovery apple? Not sure. Is that one? I don't know.
Yeah.
And the plum.
Isn't a plum just a plum?
I don't know. There's Victoria plums and all sorts of different plums.
Oh,
I know Victoria. Yeah. So look, we still need answers. So tune in next time to find out what they're called. But on that note, I thank you all again. Thank you all for listening as well. I appreciate that. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time with a very interesting chai time with an investor, IQ Capital, that invested in a unicorn that was then acquired by Oracle, which was Grapeshot. So we've got the CEO, the former CEO of Grapeshot, and one of the key investors, Max, from IQ Capital, coming in to talk around how that investment happened and the success and how they built Grapeshot into a successful company acquired by Oracle. So on that note, thank you. See you again
Sunil.
soon.
And listen, Sunil, I just posted a couple of things on the chat. If people are interested in academic spin outs, they can go to the paper I wrote about what I did at BU. And then we have this great conference next week, happens once a year. This year it's virtual and free, and we're getting a lot of global participants. I encourage all of you to sign up.
Did you put that on the chat, the link to it?
Yeah, I did. I put it on the chat.
Okay, let me just check it's there. You need to put it on the open chat. You've put it on the panelist chat.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, if you just stick it on the Q&A piece rather than the panelist chat, and then that will go to everybody.
Okay.
And then maybe we can send that link out to when we follow up with the people that couldn't make it but then did register with the recorded video. We can maybe send you a link along with that as well.
Yeah, I don't think it allows me to put it on the Q&A.
We'll send it out.
Let me try doing it to, let's see if that works. So
That worked. I can see it. Thanks.
Awesome.
Thanks again for your times.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a great day.